It's just after midnight, September 26, 1983. A Soviet lieutenant colonel is alone in a bunker outside Moscow, staring at a screen. His job is simple. If that screen shows incoming American missiles, he picks up the phone. He reports upward. The retaliatory sequence begins. The math is automatic from there. The screen lights up. 1 missile detected, then 2, then 3, 4, 5, incoming from the continental United States. He does not pick up the phone. What happened in that bunker and why one man's decision to do nothing may be the single most consequential act of the entire Cold War is what this video is about. By the end, you'll understand not just what he did, but why the system gave him no choice, and what it means that the only thing standing between humanity and nuclear war was one man deciding the rules were wrong. To understand why that moment was possible, you have to understand the board as it existed in September 1983. The Cold War had entered one of its most dangerous phases, not the most publicized, 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis gets that title, but by almost every intelligence measure, 1983 was more unstable. Relations between Washington and Moscow had degraded to their lowest point in decades. Hotlines that had once carried détente through the 1970s had gone nearly silent. Diplomatic channels were frozen. A hotline that once buzzed between Washington and Moscow had effectively collapsed into mutual suspicion. Just 3 weeks before the bunker incident, a Soviet fighter jet had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people on board, including sitting U.S. Congressman Lawrence McDonald of Georgia. The Reagan administration had responded with rhetorical fury. Soviet leadership, already deeply paranoid, was now convinced that the Americans might be planning a first strike under the cover of a military exercise. That paranoia had a name: Operation Ryan. A massive Soviet intelligence directive launched in May 1981 by KGB chairman Yuri Andropov specifically tasked KGB and GRU networks worldwide with watching for signs that the West was preparing a nuclear decapitation strike. The Soviets were not posturing. They genuinely believed it was coming.
And that belief had reshaped their entire nuclear doctrine. One Soviet intelligence operation, launched 2 years earlier, had turned that paranoia into protocol. Protocol that would make the events of September 26th almost inevitable. By 1983, the Soviet Union had deployed a constellation of early warning satellites, the OCO system, designed to detect the heat signatures of intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from the continental United States. The satellites were positioned in highly elliptical Molniya orbits, designed to look down at American missile fields from high angles, where the sun's reflection off missile plumes would be maximally visible against a dark background. On paper, it was a sophisticated system. In practice, and this is what the Soviets did not fully know, it had a flaw.
The OCO satellites worked by detecting contrast, the heat and light of a rising missile against a cold, dark surface, reliable under most conditions. But under one specific alignment, when the satellite's angle placed a missile field directly between the sensor and areas of sunlit cloud cover on the horizon, the system could misread reflected sunlight as a missile launch. The Soviets knew this was theoretically possible. They had built in a verification requirement. Any alert had to be confirmed by ground-based radar before being treated as definitive. Ground radar, however, was slower. It took time. And time was exactly what Soviet doctrine had decided the system couldn't afford. The logic behind that decision is worth sitting with, because it's flawless and it's terrifying.
Here's the math. An American ICBM launched from the continental United States would reach Soviet territory in approximately 25 to 30 minutes. Soviet leadership needed time to make a decision, authenticate it, transmit launch orders, and have their own missiles in the air before the incoming warheads arrived. Strip out the bureaucracy, the chain of command, the authentication codes, and you have a decision window of maybe 10 minutes, 15 if everything went perfectly. That is not enough time to wait for confirmation. So the Soviets had built a system that was optimized for speed over accuracy. If the satellite said missiles were coming, you reported it. You didn't wait for ground radar to confirm. You reported it, because by the time you confirmed it, it might be too late. Every piece of that logic is rational, and every piece of it points toward catastrophe the moment the system produces a false positive. That false positive came just after midnight on September 26, 1983, and the man in the chair already knew something was wrong.
Stanislav Petrov was 44 years old. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, assigned to Serpukhov 15, the command center responsible for processing OCO satellite data and relaying alerts upward through the strategic command chain. He was also a signal processing engineer who would help design some of the very systems he was monitoring, giving him a depth of knowledge about the OCO architecture's weaknesses that a standard watch officer would not have had. He was not supposed to be there that night. He was filling in for a sick colleague, a detail that would later strike almost everyone who heard the story as the kind of thing that makes you reconsider whatever you believe about fate. His job, stated plainly, was not to make decisions. It was to relay them. If the system showed a launch, he reported it. His superiors would then make the decision to retaliate. Petrov was a node in a chain, a highly trained, deeply knowledgeable node, but a node. The doctrine was explicit. He was not authorized to exercise independent judgment on whether an alert was real. Just after midnight, the alert came. One missile. The panel lit up. The word that appeared, in Russian, rendered in bold capital letters on the display, was launch. Petrov described it later as the loudest alarm I'd ever heard in my life. Sirens, flashing panels, a display he had never seen trigger in a non-exercise context. His staff of approximately 200 was looking at him. He picked up the phone to his commanding officer and did not report a launch. He reported a system malfunction. He had no evidence it was a malfunction. He had a hunch, and he had about 90 seconds to be right.
In chess, there's a category of position called a forced move. Not a good move or a bad move, a forced move. Every other option leads to immediate material loss or checkmate. You have one legal response. The game has eliminated your agency. Soviet nuclear doctrine had constructed exactly this kind of position for Petrov. Report the launch, retaliation sequence begins. Don't report it? If the missiles are real, the Soviet Union absorbs a first strike with no response, and you've ended your country. There was no third square. The system had been designed to ensure there was no third square. What Petrov did in those minutes was something that doctrine had explicitly tried to prevent. He built one. His reasoning, reconstructed from later interviews, worked like this. First, 5 missiles. The display was showing 5 warheads incoming. If the Americans were launching a first strike, 5 missiles made no strategic sense. A genuine nuclear first strike from the United States would involve hundreds of warheads launched simultaneously, a full decapitation blow designed to eliminate Soviet retaliatory capacity before a response could be organized. 5 missiles wouldn't do that. 5 missiles would just kill you enough to guarantee retaliation. No rational actor launches 5. Second, the OCO system had known reliability problems. Petrov was an engineer by training. He had helped build this system. He understood the satellite's geometry, and he knew about the edge case solar reflection flaw. The system was not infallible. Third, and this is the part that rarely gets mentioned, the ground-based radar network had not confirmed the alert. Under doctrine, ground radar was a secondary verification, but its silence was data. None of these 3 points was conclusive. Each of them alone could be rationalized away. A first strike might use a limited launch as a decoy. The system might be working perfectly. The radar might not have acquired the targets yet.
Petrov knew all of this. He was not certain. He was making a judgment call under catastrophic uncertainty, with incomplete information, in a system explicitly designed to deny him that option. He called it a malfunction. 23 minutes later, he found out if he was right, and the answer changed everything about how we should think about nuclear deterrence.
The next 23 minutes were, by Petrov's own account, the longest of his life. He had committed. He had reported a malfunction to his commanding officer. That report would go up the chain. If the missiles were real, if they were actually in the air right now, arcing over the North Pole, the Soviet Union was now in the process of not responding. No retaliatory launch would be authorized. No missiles would leave their silos. The country would take the hit. And it would all be his fault. Petrov later said he was 50-50. Not confident, not even mostly confident. Split. He had made a call that every instrument in the room, every protocol he had been trained on, and every institutional pressure in the Soviet defense establishment told him was wrong. And now he was sitting in that bunker, watching a clock, with 200 people looking at him, waiting to find out. The ground-based radar network takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to acquire and track targets once they've cleared the horizon. If the missiles were real, the radar would find them. It did not. At approximately 12:37 a.m., the all-clear came. The Oko satellite had produced a false positive, caused by an unusual alignment of sunlight reflecting off cloud tops above an American missile field in the Midwest, producing a signature that the system had misread as a launch plume. The flaw that Soviet engineers had identified as theoretically possible had, on this particular night, occurred at exactly the wrong moment. Petrov had been right. There were no missiles. He was reprimanded for it anyway, and what his superiors did next tells you everything about why the system was so dangerous in the first place. Here is where the story becomes something more than a near miss. Petrov's commanders did not celebrate what he had done. They could not. To acknowledge that his judgment had been correct, that the doctrine was wrong and an individual officer had been right to override it, would have required them to examine the entire nuclear early warning architecture. The logic of that architecture was not just military, it was political, it was ideological. The Soviet system could not afford to conclude that one lieutenant colonel's gut had been better than its own institutional design. So instead of an investigation into the satellite flaw, Petrov was quietly investigated for a procedural violation. He had not properly logged his actions during the incident. He was reprimanded. He was eventually reassigned to a lesser post. He retired early in 1984 under circumstances that left him feeling, as he told RT in 2010, that his decision had effectively ended his military career. The satellite system was quietly corrected. No public announcement was made. The incident was classified and buried in Soviet military archives, where it sat completely unknown to the outside world until 1998, 15 years after it happened, when retired Colonel General Yuri Votintsev, the former commander of the Soviet Air Defense's missile defense units, described it in his published memoirs. By that point, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Petrov was living on a modest pension in a small apartment in Fryazino, outside Moscow, tending his garden. The world had almost ended. He had stopped it. And then he had been forgotten by the very system whose survival he had protected. What this means for nuclear deterrence, what it means today, is the most important question in the story, and it's the one that never gets asked. The story does not end with Petrov's reprimand. It echoes. 6 weeks after the bunker incident, in November 1983, NATO launched one of its largest ever military exercises, Able Archer 83, a simulated nuclear attack sequence run through real command channels using real authentication codes involving 14 NATO nations simultaneously. Soviet intelligence,
already in a state of heightened alert under Operation Ryan, could not fully distinguish it from the real thing. KGB stations across Europe began reporting that NATO might be using the exercise as a cover for an actual first strike. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on elevated readiness levels that some U.S. intelligence assessments, examining the evidence years later, concluded were more acute than anything seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 near misses in 6 weeks, neither known to the public until decades later.
The pattern is not coincidence. It is the signature of a deterrence system operating under conditions it was never fully designed to handle. Political hostility so extreme that every military signal was being read through the lens of worst-case interpretation. 2 events, same structural flaw, 6 weeks apart. The Petrov incident and Able Archer together form the clearest possible argument for why the architecture of nuclear deterrence itself was the danger, not just the missiles, but the decision-making structure built around them. A system that removes human judgment to increase response speed is a system that cannot distinguish between an incoming warhead and a misaligned satellite. The Americans faced a parallel version of the same problem in 1979 when a training tape was accidentally fed into a live NORAD computer, triggering a rapid scramble before the error was caught. Different mechanism, identical structural flaw. Speed had been prioritized over verification, and verification is the only thing that prevents a false signal from becoming a real one.
This is the strategic lesson that the chessboard makes visible. When you optimize your position entirely for tempo, for speed, for the initiative, you expose yourself to catastrophic error in the one scenario you most need to avoid. The position that looks strongest often contains the deepest vulnerability. In 2013, 30 years after the incident, Stanislav Petrov was awarded the Dresden Peace Prize, given to him at a ceremony in a city that itself knew something about what the end of the world looks like from the ground. He used part of the prize money to fix his washing machine. He died in May 2017 at 77 in his apartment in Friazino, outside Moscow. The Russian government issued no statement. There was no state funeral, no military honor. The man who, by every reasonable measure, had prevented the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, died as he had lived after that night, quietly and without official acknowledgement.
What Petrov understood that the system did not is something that applies beyond nuclear command centers, beyond Cold War bunkers, beyond the specific horror of 1983. He understood that the confidence of a system is not the same thing as the correctness of a system, that a protocol can be perfectly logical and still perfectly wrong, that there are moments when the bravest move on the board is to refuse the forced move, to sit still while every instrument in the room tells you to act, because something in the position doesn't add up. He was 50-50. He still didn't make the call. The world didn't end. That's the only reason we know his name.
If this story changed how you think about nuclear deterrence or about the gap between institutional logic and human judgment, the channel has more. Kennedy's gambit during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the strategic collapse at Stalingrad. Every one of these stories is about the same thing. What happens when the rules of the game stop matching the reality of the board? Subscribe. The next one's already in production.